So first off, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for making the time. I know how busy a lot of you are, and it's great that you were willing to come and spend a couple days together. We've got an awesome room. I'm just looking around at all the faces and all the experience, and in my head I just tried to do some math, and we probably have about 500 plus years of tennis-specific training experience in this room. So even though a lot of people may not be speaking, the information in the room is unbelievable. We've got strength coaches, athletic trainers, physical therapists, chiropractors, medical doctors, tennis coaches, massage therapists, yoga instructors, nutritionists, plus a lot of other folks that I may not even know. So make sure you utilize the time the next couple days, not only to listen to what's being said, but more so the discussions that we're having. And we're trying to leave a lot of time for networking, socializing, chatting. Also, if there is anyone looking for strength and conditioning jobs, let me know. There's about 10 right now that we're trying to fill across the country in different parts. So if anyone's interested in athletic training or strength and conditioning predominantly right now, there's quite a few jobs available, so come find me and I can give you more information on that. I want to thank the USTA. Unbelievable what they're willing to do to help support education and all the folks behind the scenes to make the event work. It's really, really valuable, and there's a lot of people it takes to make these things work. So thank them, thank the staff, thank everyone involved, and also thank the speakers as well, because they gave up their time to help educate all of us, and we're going to have a good time. From a schedule standpoint, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We've got quite a few sessions in here. We've got some sessions on court, and we've got some sessions in the gym. So we've got a kind of nice mix. And then we've got a few breakouts where we're going to have just discussions, let people talk about the areas that are most important to them with some of the experts that are here. So the goal really is to have your questions answered, because we've tried to have a schedule that is pretty broad to cover a lot of different things. But there's a lot of people here that work with high-level juniors. There's a lot of people here that work with adults. There's a lot of people here that work across the spectrum, beginners to very advanced, and everyone needs something a little different. We understand that, so we can't cover everything, but use the time to try to ask the questions of the experts that are here that maybe have the skill sets that you're looking for, because there are definitely a lot of great folks here, and hopefully over the next couple days we'll all be able to share information. My job sort of today is to open this up with thoughts more than anything. I want you to think through lenses that maybe you don't always think through, or think about concepts that may not necessarily be that easily applicable always in your world, based on budget, based on staffing, based on the players you work with, but just so you're aware of sort of what's out there. So I'm going to do sort of a quick overview of what are some of the things out there in the field right now, what are people using, what's the technologies that people are dabbling with, what are some of the new research says from a monitoring standpoint, from a recovery standpoint. Some of this stuff some of you are very familiar with, and some of this stuff may be way outside what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But it helps as you hear some of the other presentations, just to sort of see how could that possibly relate to some of the other things that we've got going on. So before we sort of figure out what we need to do, or what we need to buy, or what we need to use, we've got to ask the right questions. What are we trying to measure? What are we trying to monitor? What are the questions that we're trying to get answered? And many of you probably have one or two big questions you want answered, but what are the reasons behind that? Is it improving performance? Is it reducing injury? Is it improving certain shots on the court that they struggle with based on poor footwork? Is it lack of strength and their inability to get in and out of the corners? Is it their inability to play multiple matches in a day because they don't have the aerobic capacity and the endurance? Is it, do they cramp all the time and we don't know how to handle that? Ask those questions on a regular basis and write them down, because typically you're going to see it again and again and again with the next player. And if you're in a large group, you're going to have 10 players that have similar issues. So that's one of the things that is really valuable, is to have your top 10 list of issues and have really good, precise, simple ways to address them. Make your life a bit easier. So one of the big challenges we're seeing is the undertraining issue. we've moved the pendulum sometimes too far. And when I say under training, meaning that players may be out doing things time-wise, but they're doing it possibly inefficiently or they're doing it incorrectly. The challenge we're seeing a lot is that you've got a big push to be careful about injuries, which is totally understandable, but are we training them enough, especially the juniors, to adapt and to be resilient enough for the demands of the tournaments? And if they have to play 4 days straight, 2 to 3 matches a day for 4 days, yet you're only doing an hour and a half of training on their training blocks, is that enough volume and load to be able to handle a 4-day tournament with 2 or 3 matches in a day? Usually it's not. Most sports are dealing with this. It's not just a tennis issue. It's many, many sports. You know, historically, there's an argument some players overtrain. That's definitely true. Some players overtrain today. That's true as well. But if you look at the totality of places around the country, there's a move to do a little less, yet the demands of the environments are still really high. So they don't have the resiliency and they don't have that, they haven't adapted enough to handle that. So first off, be careful with that, because it's always easy to say we're going to do less, but what are the negative consequences of doing less? That means they're not prepared for the demands that you want them to do in competition. So that's always a risk. The technology piece, everyone gravitates to that. I spent a lot of time in the technology world and there's a lot of cool stuff out there. Some of the stuff's very inaccurate, so be careful first off. Just because you get numbers doesn't mean the numbers are reliable or valid. Many times they're not, especially if the device is very simple. Most of the time, the simpler the device, the less accurate it is. Not always, but many times. So just because it looks interesting and it gives you numbers, do your due diligence on whatever it is, that make sure that it's got some validation and some reliability behind it and that you're willing to accept whatever error that is. So error's not a problem. Every wearable that's out there, every phone app that's out there, every piece of technology you use has some form of error. What is acceptable for your purpose? If I'm working with a top 50 professional, my acceptable error is very small. I need that number to be super accurate because their livelihood is based on them making that 1% improvement. And if that error is 20%, that's a useless piece of equipment for that level player. If I've got a group of 20 juniors and I just want to show them something, hey, that movement wasn't as good as that movement and that error was 10 or 20%, that's probably fine for that purpose because you're just trying to educate them and you're using it for education. So understand the error and understand who your population is. It's really, really important. And I think a lot of people make a real big error in that because they don't understand that error is acceptable, but is it acceptable for the population and for the purpose that you're using it for? The paralysis by analysis issue is something that we all deal with. Like, don't get stuck in analyzing too deeply if it's not giving you an outcome you need. You know, data is very, very valuable. All of us here probably like data. That's why we're here. The challenge is many people go so deep into data that's not relevant, not applicable, or really, really difficult to even operationalize. Like, you collect 10,000 data points. What are you going to do with it? That's the hardest part is, you know, all the things out there that you can collect. If you do a force plate, anyone done force plate testing? Okay, force plate testing is very quick and easy. The amount of data points you get from that can be in the hundreds of thousands from one jump if you actually want to look at it in that much depth. What's the value of that? For most people, it's probably not 100,000 pieces of information that are worthwhile. It's probably 5 pieces of information that are worthwhile. So keep that in mind when you're going through your analysis of whatever it is you're looking at. So the wearable tech space, because this is a question that comes up a lot. Tennis has a lot of challenge with wearable technology because of the movements, the stop-start nature of the sport, the environmental conditions. Being out in the sun and sweating so much makes wearables challenging. The small movements, the very quick decelerations and reaccelerations for certain, whether it's GPS, whether it's inertial sensors, whether it's gyroscopes or accelerometers, makes tennis really difficult because of the nature of the sport. Camera-based systems are becoming more popular because they can be utilized, but they're very expensive still. And everyone is hoping that, pose estimations, which is basically using a single camera, let's say an iPhone, and you can estimate a lot of factors from that. They're hoping that's going to be accessible pretty soon and relatively accurate. The challenge with that is you get no depth perception. A one camera angle isn't going to give you the depth perception to be able to do 3D motion really at all. So there's a lot of products out there though that look cool and look like, hey, it's giving me some information, which it is, but you have to be very careful with what you want to use it for. So there's a lot of that, and the next 2 years is going to be crazy. The amount of products that are just about to hit the market is out of control at the moment. So just do your due diligence. There's a lot of stuff that looks really interesting and could be really good in 2 or 3 years, but there's a lot of stuff that is very inaccurate right now, and it's a normal process of research and development. They've got to put it out there, they've got to get feedback, they've got to see what works, what doesn't, and they fine-tune over time. But as you can see here, this is pretty much the athletes there, sort of in the center, but look at all, and this is not a complete list obviously, but it's a list of all the things that we're trying to understand and all the things that are trying to be involved. All of us here are a bit of a piece of this. We're trying to put this all together to try to make that athlete or those athletes that you work with the best they can be with the information that we have, which makes our life challenging. Because if you don't understand this, it doesn't matter what you're measuring. So this is pretty simple. I use this a lot because it just allows us to go through what is daily activity for athletes. This is the same for a regular person, but the stresses from an athletic environment are unique because of the physiological strain, the exercise, the increase in heart rate, the increase in all the physiological metrics, such as CO2 levels go up, lactate levels go up, your pH levels drop. All the different things that happen when someone exercises have this cascading effect that causes fatigue. But then when we all say fatigue, most of us know what it is in theory, but when you actually try to define it accurately, fatigue's a really tough thing to define. Because you've got metabolic fatigue, which is at the cellular level, muscle fatigue most people think of. But then you have neural fatigue, which is nervous system fatigue, which has as much, if not more, of a negative impact on athletes. Much harder for many people to see as coaches, as trainers, because nervous system fatigue is the inability to produce an output, even though they may not be super tired visually. Like if someone runs 10 400s, at the end, you can tell they're tired. I think all of us could see that, and we would all be like, that person is tired. If someone does, 10 box jumps from a high height with a minute rest between, you're probably not going to see them as being tired, but their nervous system's going to be pretty fatigued. So make sure that you're clear on what you think fatigue is, because many people misinterpret fatigue because they're only looking at one type. They're looking at much more at the metabolic fatigue. All fatigue is mixed, but understand that with a lot of the training that many of our athletes do, we overemphasize fatigue from a metabolic standpoint, and we underemphasize the impact of neural fatigue. So starting to monitor neural fatigue is really important, and there's ways to do that. It's not as easy to do. There are some estimates, say a power output, a jump height metric or a drop jump metric or something like that is a simple way to test. It's not always the most accurate, but it is a way to test for neural fatigue. And then there's other factors as well. Heart rate variability has become very popular. The challenge with heart rate variability is there's multiple variables that control heart rate variability, and it's not as simple as a number goes up or a number goes down and that tells us whether it's good or bad. There's a lot of error in heart rate variability, especially because the monitoring devices, whether it's wrist, let's say Whoop is probably the most common one, or you have an Oura Ring. Most people are familiar with one of those two. They're the two biggest in the market right now as wearables. They both have error, and they both have significant error. Whoop has higher error typically because of the measurement sensor. It's just similar to an Apple Watch from a standpoint of how it measures. The challenge there is anywhere from 10 to 30% inaccurate as a measurement. They're getting better each generation. They're on their 6th generation right now. So they're making improvements every time, but the measurement technology has some built-in error. It always will. It's not as accurate as a chest strap. So an EKG reading, a true ECG or EKG reading like a polar heart strap is more accurate, but most people don't want to wear that all day, every day. So the wrist-worn wearables have become popular. Oura Ring is another one. They have a skin sensor as well, and Whoop's adding that, which adds another layer of analysis, which, again, the more variables you have, in theory, it should lower the error because you've got multiple variables that you can look at. When we get to overcompensation, which is the goal, that's usually dictated by how do we recover. What restoration strategies, recovery strategies, regeneration strategies do you have in place? And do they work? The biggest challenge most of you deal with is athletes and people in general want to feel like they're doing something without doing anything. So sitting with Normatec boots, lying on something that may or may not help with recovery is what everyone's comfortable doing, but how much of an impact does it actually make? And if you look at the data at the end, I've got a slide of just sort of putting a very simple red, orange, green situation on all the big recovery techniques that are out there and how efficient or effective are they. And again, a lot of the time it's just getting people off their feet is part of the benefit. So it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a blanket. You put them under a weighted blanket and say, this is your recovery session. That's by itself valuable because they're not on their feet, they're not moving around, things like that. And the entire recovery space, as we all know, has blown up. There's so many things in the space. A lot of it has some evidence or some research, but it's not necessarily significant, meaning that it makes that much of a difference compared to just sitting there. So most of those studies will compare it to passive recovery, which is just sitting. And then if you're using, think about whatever your favorite recovery device is, think about how that works and what's the mechanism. And we'll talk about that in a little bit because that is a big, good area for discussion. And then the question is, when's the next loading phase? Is it 3 hours later? So 2-a-days. You go from 9 to 11, have 3 hours off, you go from 2 to 5. What do you do in a 3-hour period to allow that athlete to do that second session at the highest level possible? That all is determined by what happens here. If this isn't monitored, then you don't really know, is 3 hours the right number? Is 5 hours the right number? Is the next day the right number? Just because a coach in the 60s had 2-a-days and they went from 9 to 11 and 2 to 5, does that mean we should be doing that in 2024? I mean, that is typically what happens. You coach how you were coached, and that gets sent down, and usually the best athletes adapt to any training program just about, and they're going to be successful whatever we do because they're gifted and they're brilliant and they're genetically able to handle loads that most normal people can't handle. But is that the right training program for, let's say you got 20 players in your academy that you're working with, and you say, well, this player who we had 10 years ago and was a success, we're going to use that training program for every other person that we see. We've all done that to an extent. We've all used an example of someone good and say, we want you to train like that. That's, at this day and age, with the information we have and the data that we have, that's pretty disrespectful to those players because they're all so different. We know that. We shouldn't expect to train them all the same way. But we do need to train them hard enough for whatever the demands are. So if we know they want to play Wimbledon or the US Open, and they're going to play 5 sets or something over multiple days, you better train them hard enough to handle that. That's the important part, is what is the training program for that athlete based on the outcome you want from them. Yeah.
Can you define tissue damage?
Yeah, great question. So tissue damage can be defined across multiple spectrums because you've got truly bruising, start at that. You get punched, and there is edema of some sort, and that's a form of tissue damage. You have tissue damage where your nutrients, whatever those are being depleted because you're exercising significantly. Think about it from a pH level. If your pH drops because it becomes more acidic environment, your CO2 goes up, you've got these negative metabolites that need to be removed so that tissue is damaged in a short period of time. Doesn't mean it's damaged for a long period of time. It could be for 20 seconds, a minute, until oxygenated blood brings back those nutrients and refills it. Think of it as a bucket that has a hole in it and it loses the water. If it doesn't get water replaced, you've got no water left and you can't do anything. If that water gets replaced, even though there's a hole there, it can stay at the same level. If you have enough water replacing whatever's being lost, you don't have any change in the water level. So it's a great question. Okay, the recovery stages, again, pretty straightforward. This is just more detail of what we just talked about. And the reason I like to talk through this is because you have to understand the cycle. And the cycle's complicated. And this is not everything. But think about this. You've got CNS issues, you've got cortisol issues, you've got contractile protein issues, parasympathetic tone changes, heart rate variability, sympathetic tone, increased cortisol levels over here. You've got adrenal function issues. This is just standard physiology that happens with any type of stress. And every time we train in the gym, on the court, on the track, whatever it is, we're putting our body through this stressor, which is a catabolic environment. You're breaking down the body. Remember, training is the worst thing we can do for the body in that moment. It's not helpful in the moment. It's only helpful if they adapt positively to it. So we all think training's good for players. Training's the worst thing for them at the moment. We're destroying the body, literally. It's uncomfortable, we're stressing them, we're doing all these things with the goal of they're going to adapt and they're going to improve and they're going to build because our recovery cycle is optimized. If you screw up the recovery cycle, this is all bad and it stays bad. And that's what we need to do a better job of figuring out how we monitor and measure that. So that's hard because everyone's responses are different. And so we can use a standard protocol or something we do with everyone, and that'll work for, let's say, a third of that group. 2/3 of that group it probably isn't the right strategy for. So keep that in mind as you go through. So how do you monitor? These, to bucket it, this is the way I think is the simplest way to look at it, but there's layers of complexity under it. So at the most simple level, you have 4 broad areas. You have this internal objective area. Give me an objective metric that looks at the inside of the body somehow. What is that? That could be heart rate variability, resting heart rate, glucose monitoring now with continuous glucose monitors. It's really interesting to see that from an athlete standpoint. You've got VO2 metrics. Most of you are familiar with all these terms. If you're not familiar with any of the terms, just ask. Lactate levels. Those are typical internal objective metrics that are accurate if it's done right. It's got decades and decades of reliable and valid data from the research that we can trust the measurements. So that's valuable because it's objective, it's internal. Players can't make it up, they can't fake it, it is what it is. Internal subjective, these are the surveys basically. RPE scores, how do you feel scores, wellness scales, all those type of things. You ask the player, how do you feel? Highly motivated players, these are pretty accurate. If you work with really motivated players that answer correctly, they're pretty accurate. If you're working with mid-level players or players that are there because someone else is pushing them to be there, these scales are really inaccurate. So you've got to be careful with who you use subjective scales with. So that's a challenging area, but a very valuable one because perceived fatigue is real fatigue. Even though the numbers may not always show it, they may just hate being there. So the numbers physically aren't bad, but they feel fatigued because it's the 3rd hour of a tennis practice and they hate tennis. And they're just there because that's what they do Tuesdays and Thursdays and you have to deal with it. So understand what these metrics may show. External objective, this is becoming more and more popular because technology's got better. So if if you've got access to, say, Hawkeye, for example, if you're playing on courts at the professional level and there are all these metrics that Hawkeye gathers, this falls into this area. If you can wear a GPS, it falls into that area. Usually it's giving you broad workload metrics. How far does someone run? How fast does someone run? You can start getting into accelerations and deceleration metrics. So you start getting a picture on what is the workload and can we put objective numbers to that in the right way that we can use that for our workload calculations. So this has become super popular. Tennis obviously is a little harder still than most sports to measure because of the change of directions in such small spots. So global metrics is a little bit better still than the real fine, quick movements. Even with the best equipment out there, there's still some error in these metrics, so you have to be a bit careful. Simple things like a daily vertical jump, which I'm sure some of you do some form of this. You're just trying to get a sense of what does the athlete have today. If their vertical jump scores change significantly from day to day, that's not a good sign. That means that there's something going on. There's some fatigue that's causing their number to go down 2 or 3 inches from one day to the next. That shouldn't really happen unless you expect it to happen. So let's say you go 4 days in a row, pre-season for a high-level player, and it's week 2 in pre-season, and that's usually the hardest week for most athletes. Reason being is the first week, if you're smart, you're not going to destroy them. If you're an idiot, you'll destroy them the first week, and then they'll be, their hip flexors and their hamstrings will be done by about Friday or Saturday of the first week, and then you'll have to take 4 days off, let them recover, and you'll lose a whole week of practice usually. Normally now, most of you are going to build into that first week, and by the second week, they're going to have enough that you can then work them really hard, and by the second Thursday or Friday, you would expect them to be pretty much spent, and their vertical jump scores are going to drop. And that's maybe a metric out of many metrics that you use to say, okay, I want it to go Friday to be our last really, really hard day. It looks like Thursday they're pretty much done. That's going to be our really hard day. We come back on Friday and we do a 2-hour session instead of doing 2 a day on Friday. That's potentially how you can use some of that data to make your decisions a little bit better. And then external subjective, that's kind of all of us. We have the player's perspective from a subjective standpoint, but then us as coaches, trainers, therapists, parents, we have a pretty good handle on that athlete to an extent, if we see him regularly, that we can read body language, we can see how they perform, we can see the irritation level they have, and we give a scale of some sort. So if you can track at least one metric from each of these 4 buckets, you got a reasonably good picture on what's happening with your athlete. If you can collect 2 or 3 from especially this side and 1 from those sides, you got a really good picture of what's going on. So this hopefully gives you some things to think about. I'm sure some of you do a bit of this. Some of you may do all of it to an extent. Some of you may not do any of this. So think about what you can add to your programming that can just give you a little bit more insight into what your athletes are doing. Sure.
Are there norms available to allow this kind of?
Depends. The question is about norms, and are there norms available? To most of these, there aren't. I wouldn't say VO2. There's norms. Where should tennis players fall? But it's broad, because the challenge for tennis is, if you were to test 10 tennis players, you'd have a VO2 range. Let's use the females. So female WTA players, if you tested their VO2, take the top 10 in the world, they would range from about 45 to 62, somewhere in that zone. Satoshi, correct me if I'm wrong on that, if you think. Yeah, so 45 is pretty low, but there's some top 10 players in the world that'll probably be in the 40s. And there's going to be some studs that are going to be in this close to 60, 65. They're going to be comparable to the US women's national team soccer. And they can both be top 10 in the world. So the challenge with that is 45 bad? Well, 45 is on the low end. You probably don't want to use that as your, that's acceptable level. But 60 is really impossible for most players, unless you've got the right genetics and typically you've got parents that were endurance athletes of some sort. So we know that somewhere in the low 50s is probably ideal. So that's the challenge with norms, especially the higher up you get. So we typically say, what's a floor? You've got to be at least above this level to have a chance. And then if you want to be great, you want to be a level or two above that. And if you're not, you better be great at some of the other factors. Let's say we're using endurance, for example. If you're only 45 on your endurance, on your VO2, well, I assume you got a huge serve and you're unbelievably fast. If you don't have a huge serve and you're not unbelievably fast, it's going to be really hard to be top 10 in the world. So that's kind of where the scenarios come in. That's why norms, at the lower levels, it's relatively easy because you just want them in a mix. So we know norms for a lot of stuff, such as vertical jump. You've got to have some power output to play tennis. You don't have to be unbelievable though. Most tennis players' verticals aren't great. If you take the top 100 juniors in the country today and do verticals on them, there are some horrible vertical jumpers out there. I mean, terrible. To the point where you would be, you couldn't understand how they could be a national level junior athlete in any sport. Yet they're a darn good tennis player. They can win matches, they can go far at the big tournaments. So those players typically aren't going to necessarily be the best in the world though, because their floor is so low. And unless they train unbelievably well, and unless they usually have some weapon that is so good that they can hide some of that, that's where we want to kind of be able to monitor and measure this, but also understand there's so many variables in tennis that you can be lower than normal in one, but you can't be lower in a lot of them.
Mark, I have a question if you
Yeah.
don't mind. How do you like the patches to measure glucose for athletic development? How do you find them?
Yeah, so everyone's familiar with continuous glucose monitors. So obviously it started from a diabetic standpoint. It was never used for athletes. It was never designed for athletes. It's continuous, so you measure it, you wear it, and it usually measures, for up to 2 weeks typically. You can use it, and when you sweat a lot, it's hard to stay on. That's the challenge with it. But it's definitely valuable. The challenge is you get a little bit of noise when you start exercising at a really high level. Obviously, it wasn't designed for exercise. It was designed for food and analyzing spikes in glucose due to the foods you would eat and how it impacts blood sugar. But it does give you a sense over time. And again, there's error there, so it's one of those things as long as you're aware of the error. But there are companies that are working on it from an athletic standpoint more, because all the original ones weren't designed for athletes. But like everything else, if an athlete feels or a coach feels they can get some benefit, they're going to utilize what's out there. And the challenge what we all have is we can only utilize the technologies that are available. There's a lot of stuff we would love to measure easily with a patch or with a camera or something, but the technology is not there yet. Similar to this. This is like really good if you're not exercising. The moment you start exercising, it can change it a little bit. But again, it's better than what we didn't have anything 5-10 years ago. Now at least we can see how all these different foods impact it, and then food on top of the exercise. So what are you eating? Let's say you play 2 practice sessions and you have just water in one and you do whatever your snacking profile is.
I just want to add,
Yep.
hi, I'm Tara, sports dietitian here at the USTA. So in my experience working with continuous glucose monitors, it adds more confusion than clarity.
Yep.
At this time, I think we need more research into, like you're saying, working with athletes. But if you are going to have an athlete who's interested, you can get one yourself. So they, I remember the first time we had an athlete show up with one, and I was like, where'd you get that, and what are you doing with it? So people can get them. So if they are, please contact your dietitian to help with, understanding what the numbers are and what the impact is, because they can get really confused when all of a sudden their glucose spikes when they're exercising. They're like, oh my God, what do I do? Well, your glucose is spiking because your body needs energy right now, so it's getting energy from your stores. It's not necessarily because Gatorade has too much sugar.
It's such a valuable, and thank you for mentioning it, because the confusion is real. Because with most people, they don't have the information or the education. So find the experts, work with the people in your local communities, work with the USTA if you're working with high-level national players, use the resources you have, because it makes a really, really big difference, and it is challenging. The problem is every week someone's coming with some new piece of tech that may or may not be accurate. Like glucose monitors are pretty accurate if you're sedentary. When you start exercising, you better know what the changes mean.
I have a question.
Yep.
Did you use vertical jump just as an example, or is that something that you feel like has changed? You said in the recent 5 to 10 years, when you looked at that, they weren't very high.
No, it depends how far back you go. If you go back 30 years, you had, I would say, as a general rule, a larger number of slightly better athletes throughout. Now you have a few more exceptional athletes at the top end in tennis, but your breadth is not as good. So, the depth of good athlete in tennis is not great. You have some exceptional ones at the top. Going back, the depth of athlete wasn't as high at the top level, but their depth was better. As a general rule, I wouldn't say, because looking at USTA first started fitness testing in '88. That was the first tennis combine kind of concept. They did it with PTR originally in Hilton Head, and you had a really good core group of players. You had like Agassi and Sampras in that era, Lindsay Davenport, all of that level player was in these. So that's the earliest data I've seen. And you saw the scores were deeper, like they were better, but the high level athlete is better now, if that makes sense. Okay, so again, nothing new for most of you, but how much of this are you actually doing? Are you measuring things like this? This is not an all-encompassing list, but it is a list. And ask yourself what is on your list. Do you measure half of these, some of these, none of these? And again, there's no perfect list, but you probably do want to measure enough that can help you make better decisions. The worst thing you can do, though, is measure stuff you never use. And we've all done that. We've all measured a bunch of stuff because we thought we were going to use it, or we want to measure it because we're interested, but then you never use it for any practical purpose. And unless you're in a research study, there's really not much point doing that. So some people do that a lot. They measure, but they really don't make any decisions based on that. It goes back to that paralysis by analysis issue. It's like, why are you doing it? I'm going to run through quickly this, just because I know we're going to run out of time. I want to highlight something. This was something Satoshi led. This was actually a really good project. Couple years of case study, really research on 2 top WTA players. And tracking them really simply. We're talking about all this fancy tech and all of this stuff. The challenge is when you're on the road, when you're with players, sometimes you don't really have access to a ton of stuff. So this is a very, very simple study looking at RPE and time. I said, that's meant to be RPE, sorry about that. In general here, what we're looking at is a combined workload score. So it's just the time multiplied by the RPE. Nothing very difficult. Everyone can do that. And you just plot that on a daily basis, and you have a very simple measure of workload. Yeah, you could use GPS, you could use heart rate, you could use a bunch of other metrics to get a workload type of measure. But this is a very simple one that most players can do and most coaches can do. And it just gives us numbers. And again, don't worry about the exact number, but just sort of see how the colors change. So you've got, yellow, dark orange, and then you've got red. So the red is sort of when you get this major spike. So you get a major spike during this one tournament over here, where it was significantly higher than the training weeks, than some of the other tournament weeks. The scenario there is the weather environment contributes. They get further in the tournament, they play longer matches. There's all these things that cause a spike in workload, which we all know what causes spikes in workload. The question is how well you're monitoring that. You may feel it subjectively, and all of us have a reasonable sense of what looks hard, but let's put some numbers to it. So that's sort of valuable. Again, the goal here is just, are you doing something like this to monitor training weeks and tournament weeks? And we can share that. There's a couple papers out of this that were really practical, useful, and it just allows you to sort of see from week to week what's happening. And then if you start getting 1 week of red is acceptable, especially in a tournament. You're not going to pull someone out of a tournament typically if they're not injured. They're just having a hard week. They're playing a lot of matches. They're winning usually, which is great. That's what we want. The challenge you have is what do you do the next week? And at some levels, what do you do the week after? You go 2 weeks in a row playing 6, 8 matches, and then let's say at the pro level, you're making money, you're getting ranking points, you get a wild card into the 3rd week, and you've played 6 matches the first week, 6 matches the second week. You probably shouldn't play the 3rd week, but there's money and points and everything on the table. What do you do as a player? What do you do as a coach? Do you play that 3rd week or not? Well, the top players won't because they don't need the money or the points usually, so they make the smart decision. The person 200 in the world who needs the points and the money goes plays. And then they back hurts for 3 weeks, they hurt their shoulder, their knee hurts, and they're out for a month because they tried to play that 1 extra week without listening to the numbers. And how many of you have dealt with players like that at the junior level, at the pro level? It happens all the time. You try to get that extra little bit out of someone, and you may, once or twice in a year, but you're not going to do it every single time that pops up. So we need to use numbers like this to really help educate and support a lot of these players, parents, agents, whoever's pushing the athlete to play that extra week, and to highlight why this is probably not the best idea. You know, that's the hardest part of your job when you're working with players that are pretty good, is when to pull back. Players that lose first round every week, that's easy. Play another week. You lost. Keep going. Play 6 weeks in a row. You know, you haven't won any matches. You got to play. If you're winning 4 to 6 matches a week, that's a lot of volume. Yeah, that's the acute chronic ratio. Yeah, so that's the 4 weeks. So the current week happening, you know, divided by the 4 previous weeks, or the, you know. So yeah. So again, this is not a great predictor of injury. So just, you know, originally this came out and it was sort of used initially as a injury predictor calculation because some of the stuff came from soccer and there was some loose data that sort of showed that. Now it's not really utilized for that purpose. The data isn't very good saying it's going to cause injury, but it is very good at saying spikes in volume. It's a spike in workload is happening. Basically, this week's a lot higher than the previous weeks, the average of the previous weeks. We've talked a little bit about this. Let me just go quickly because I know we're going to run out of time. I wanted to show you something from the NBA. So I worked in the NBA for a few years, and this is a fascinating stat. If you look at this, we've got in the 80s, games missed by their stars using the exact same metric of what stars were, basically all stars, players that made the all-star game, was 10 games a year. This decade, they're missing over 24 games a year, give or take. So players today are missing way more games than they did in the past. And there's a lot of reasons why, obviously. One, it's strategy sometimes. They're trying to rest guys a little bit. There's a little bit of that going on. 2 is the athletes are stronger than they were. They train a lot harder from a strength and power standpoint. They're more explosive, so their deceleration loads are a lot harder. So when they land one time today, there's a lot more force going through the body than when they landed in the 80s because they have more force. So there's more load going through their body, which increases injury risk. There's a few other factors as well that go on. There's more distractions. So players arguably sleep maybe less and are less productive in their sleep habits today than they were 30, 40 years ago. Nutrition is arguably a lot better, but that doesn't necessarily account for these factors. Tennis isn't much different though. Looking at the tennis data, we see similar trends in the tennis data. Matches missed, injury rates, things like that. So for all of us that live in this world, we're missing something, obviously. You know, injury rates are up. You know, players aren't playing as much. When was the last time you heard about a player win 3 or 4 tournaments or go very deep in 3 or 4 tournaments in a row. If you go back to the US summer in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was very common for the top players to play 3-4 weeks and go deep, 25, 30 matches in the summer and win. Agassi did that a few times, Pat Rafter did that a few times. On the women's side, it happened a lot. So that doesn't usually happen now. You don't see those runs where players can play 3-4 weeks at a really high level. Game's faster, game's harder, there's more stress per match than there was, no doubt. But again, that's what we have to solve for. Okay, last thing, just really quick, let me move through this. This is what I said just at the beginning. The recovery techniques, all of these I think you're familiar with. If you're not familiar with any of these, let me know. But in general, pneumatic compression's really popular, Normatec boots. How do they work? Most of these work on how does it impact blood flow. So you've got heat, which moves blood, vasodilation. Cold, vasoconstricts. Compression constricts and then dilates once you release the pressure. So there's a blood pumping motion there of blood in and out. Hot colds, if you go showers, something like that, same concept. Vasoconstriction, vasodilation, back and forth. What are we doing? We're basically moving blood. So most of these are based on a similar premise, but they're a different modality trying to get at a similar result. How well can we move, poorly functioning blood, so deoxygenated blood, if we're going to describe it in a simple term. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's an easy way to describe it. Move it out and move oxygenated blood in and keep that cycle moving as much as possible, as quick as possible, as long as possible. So those are the concepts. Photobiomodulation is pretty popular right now. Red light therapy, been around a long time. It's become really popular the last 2 years, 3 years. There are some beds that are $200,000 now, which is really, really crazy price point when you think about it, because there are equivalent panels that have a same wavelength for about $400 to $600 and work really well. So be smart if you're looking at stuff like that about cost-benefit ratio. They both work. One just costs exceptionally high price. The other is a lot cheaper and has a similar value from a research standpoint and value to you. Vagus nerve stimulators, any of you deal with anxiety, players that struggle with mental stress, this is a pretty useful technique, really simple, works really, really well. A lot of good science behind it as well. So, and then all the sleep technologies that are out there, there's a bunch from mattresses, smart mattresses, to wearables that monitor EEG and that provide actually signal based on your EEG waves. So as it notices a highly stressful dream or something like that, it actually provides vibration and other techniques to try to adjust while you're sleeping. Again, pretty new technology. Again, can be helpful, but it's the newer phase. So again, there's a lot of stuff out there. Wanted to just highlight a bunch of stuff early because we got a lot of great practical discussions and sessions going forward. Hopefully this was helpful. I'm excited about the rest of the event. Look forward to chatting with everyone. And again, I want to thank the USTA for helping to host this event. So thank you all.